The Arizona sun, a molten coin in the vast blue sky, beat down on the polished chrome of the Mercedes-Benz S-Class. Marshall Dupri, his 72 years etched into the fine lines around his eyes, admired the car's sleek silhouette. He ran a hand, its skin the color of rich mahogany, over the cool, smooth hood, imagining the purr of the engine beneath. A wave of quiet satisfaction washed over him. He deserved this, a small reward after a lifetime of relentless work. He'd built his empire from the ground up, brick by painstaking brick, and a little luxury was hardly an indulgence. Inside the air-conditioned haven of Westward Motors, 3 salesmen, all sharp suits and slicked-back hair, clustered around a young couple, their laughter echoing artificially through the showroom. They radiated an almost palpable aura of eagerness, their words a practiced symphony of flattery and salesmanship. Marshall watched them, a faint flicker of something unreadable in his dark eyes. He'd been standing there for a good 10 minutes, his presence seemingly unnoticed, a ghost in an expensive suit. He wasn't accustomed to being overlooked. A woman in a crisp blazer, presumably the manager, strode past, her heels clicking on the polished tile floor. Her gaze swept over him, briefly, dismissively, before returning to the chattering group around the S-Class. A knot of irritation tightened in Marshall's stomach. Was it his age, the color of his skin, or perhaps a combination of both that rendered him invisible in this temple of luxury? He considered simply turning and leaving, finding a dealership where his presence wouldn't be an inconvenience. But something held him back, a prickle of defiance that resonated deep within him. He shifted his weight, the faint ache in his knees a reminder of the years he'd poured into building his fortune. He wouldn't be dismissed so easily. He deserved the same respect as anyone else who walked through these doors. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the air cool and scented with the faint aroma of new leather. He smoothed down his impeccably tailored suit, the subtle rustle of the fabric a small assertion of his presence. He wouldn't be ignored. He walked toward the reception desk, each step measured and calm. The young woman behind the desk, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, was engrossed in her computer screen, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She seemed oblivious to his approach, her attention focused on the digital world before her. He cleared his throat, a low rumble in the quiet showroom. The sound startled her. She looked up, her eyes widening slightly before settling into a polite, yet distant smile. "Excuse me," Marshall said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "I'm looking for some assistance." The words hung in the air, a simple request that echoed with a quiet authority. He watched the receptionist, her expression shifting subtly, a flicker of uncertainty replacing the practiced smile. He wondered if she finally recognized the weight behind his simple request, the implication of a man who was used to getting what he wanted. The receptionist stammered a quick apology, her cheeks flushing slightly. "Of course, sir. I'll find someone to assist you right away." She glanced nervously around the showroom, her eyes finally landing on one of the younger salesmen, a man named Darren who stood slightly apart from the others, observing the scene with a hesitant expression. He seemed less polished, less assured than his colleagues, a hint of uncertainty in his posture. Perhaps, Marshall thought, this young man would be more receptive. Later that night, after leaving the dealership empty-handed, the slight at Westward Motors still festered in Marshall's mind. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clinking softly, the silence of his opulent study broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Raymond Ellis, his attorney and confidant for over 40 years, sat across from him, his expression a mixture of amusement and concern. "So, you're thinking of buying the entire dealership?" Raymond asked, a hint of incredulity in his voice. Marshall took a slow sip of his whiskey, the warmth spreading through him. "Not thinking, Raymond," he said, his voice calm, almost devoid of emotion. "Doing." His eyes, however, held a glint of steel. "I believe Mr. Reiner is quite eager to sell." Raymond chuckled softly. "He'll certainly be surprised when he sees who the buyer is." The following morning, Marshall returned to Westward Motors, not as a prospective customer, but as the new owner. He arrived in a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, the gleaming vehicle a stark contrast to the modest sedan he'd driven the previous day. He stepped out of the car, his movements deliberate, his presence commanding. He saw the shock ripple through the faces of the salesmen, their earlier indifference replaced by a mixture of awe and apprehension. Brad Jensen, the young salesman who had so blatantly ignored him the day before, stared at him, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with disbelief. Marshall walked past them, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. He entered the dealership, the cool air a welcome respite from the Arizona heat. He saw the dealership manager, Tom Caldwell, hurrying towards him, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Dupri," Caldwell stammered, I don't understand. I believe you'll find everything explained in the paperwork," Marshall replied, his voice smooth, unwavering. He handed Caldwell a thick folder, the weight of it a symbolic representation of the shift in power. The following weeks saw a dramatic transformation at Westward Motors. Marshall implemented new customer service protocols, emphasizing respect and attentiveness to every individual who walked through the doors, regardless of their age, appearance, or perceived financial status. He increased employee salaries and benefits, fostering a culture of appreciation and motivation. He observed Darren, the young salesman who had shown a flicker of decency, and promoted him to sales manager. One afternoon, Marshall stood in his new office overlooking the showroom. He watched as Darren interacted with customers, his approach courteous and professional. He saw the change in the atmosphere of the dealership, the palpable shift from a culture of indifference to one of genuine customer care. A sense of quiet satisfaction settled over him. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about creating something better, something that reflected his own values. He had taken a place that had dismissed him and transformed it into something he could be proud of. The sun streamed through the large windows, illuminating the gleaming cars below. The air was filled with the low hum of conversation, the occasional laughter of satisfied customers. It was a sound that resonated with him, a sound that spoke of respect, dignity, and the quiet power of a man who knew his worth. The opulent chandelier, a cascade of crystal teardrops, cast fractured rainbows across the polished marble floor of Westward Motors. Marshall Dupri, his 72 years etched onto his face like lines on a weathered map, absorbed the scene with a quiet intensity. He ran a hand over the worn leather of his briefcase, the familiar texture grounding him amidst the gleaming chrome and glass. He'd come seeking a specific model, a Mercedes-Benz S-Class, a vehicle he'd admired for its understated elegance and powerful engine. It was a whim, perhaps a small indulgence for a man who had spent a lifetime building an empire from the ground up. But as he stood there, a sense of unease began to settle in his stomach. The receptionist, a young woman with elaborately styled hair and perfectly manicured nails, continued her phone conversation, her gaze fixed on the computer screen, oblivious to his presence. He shifted his weight, the slight ache in his knee a subtle reminder of his age. Am I invisible? He wondered, the thought a bitter pill to swallow. He'd grown accustomed to a certain level of deference, not out of vanity, but from decades of commanding respect in the business world. Here, in this temple of luxury automobiles, he felt strangely diminished, reduced to a shadow in the periphery. Minutes ticked by, each one a small erosion of his patience. He watched as other customers, younger, more flamboyantly dressed, were greeted with smiles and solicitous inquiries. The air, thick with the scent of new leather and expensive perfume, felt suddenly stifling. Perhaps this was a mistake, he mused, a flicker of doubt crossing his mind. Maybe I should just leave. But something held him there, a stubborn refusal to be dismissed. Finally, a salesman detached himself from a cluster of colleagues, approaching Marshall with a hesitant gait. This was Brad Jensen, a young man whose tailored suit and slicked-back hair screamed ambition, but whose eyes held a flicker of something less appealing, perhaps disdain, or perhaps simply indifference. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, the question lacking any genuine warmth. Marshall met his gaze, his own expression unreadable. "I'm interested in the S-Class," he stated, his voice a low rumble. Brad's eyes flicked down to Marshall's simple attire, his plain brown jacket, then back up to his face. He allowed a fraction of a second to pass before he spoke, a subtle but unmistakable dismissal. "That S-Class, that's a premium model, pretty high price point," he said, the implication hanging heavy in the air. Price point. The words echoed in Marshall's mind, each syllable grating on his nerves. He'd negotiated billion-dollar deals, overseen complex mergers and acquisitions. The price of a car, even a luxury one, was hardly a concern. "I know," he responded, his tone even, betraying none of the irritation simmering beneath the surface. Brad shifted uncomfortably, his practiced sales smile faltering. He clearly hadn't expected such a blunt response. He hadn't expected Marshall to know. He'd expected him to balk, to be intimidated, to settle for something less. "Maybe I can show you something a little more practical," he suggested, the word practical dripping with condescension. Marshall felt a cold wave of anger wash over him, a sensation so intense it almost took his breath away. He saw himself reflected in the polished chrome of a nearby car, a stoic, elderly black man in a simple jacket, dismissed and underestimated. The image sparked a flicker of something else within him, something harder, colder. It wasn't just anger. It was a resolve, a steely determination to prove them wrong, to show them just how much they had misjudged him. He looked at Brad, his gaze steady and unwavering. He didn't argue, didn't plead his case, didn't offer explanations. He simply turned, his briefcase held firmly in his hand, and walked out of the dealership. As the glass doors swung shut behind him, Brad let out a sigh of relief. He turned to his colleague, a smirk playing on his lips. "Another time-waster," he muttered, dismissing Marshall with a wave of his hand. He hadn't even bothered to learn the man's name. Marshall stood on the sidewalk, the cool evening air a welcome contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the dealership. He took a deep breath, composing himself. The anger was still there, a low hum beneath his skin, but it was now tempered with a sense of purpose. He reached for his phone, dialing a familiar number. "Raymond," he said, his voice calm and controlled. "I need you to do something for me." He paused, a glint of steel entering his eyes. "I want to buy Westward Motors." The wheels began to turn. Within hours, Raymond Ellis, Marshall's longtime attorney and confidant, had initiated the necessary inquiries. Douglas Reiner, the current owner of Westward Motors, burdened by debt and dwindling profits, was more than willing to entertain an offer. The deal was swift, silent, and ruthlessly efficient. By sunrise, Westward Motors belonged to Marshall Dupri. He returned the next morning, not as a prospective customer, but as the owner. He arrived in a chauffeur-driven car, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the previous day's attire. He walked through the glass doors, his presence now commanding the attention he had been denied before. The receptionist, her eyes wide with surprise, stammered a greeting. Brad Jensen, his face pale with shock, could only stare. Marshall surveyed the scene, a flicker of grim satisfaction in his eyes. The chandelier still cast its rainbows, the marble floor still gleamed, but the atmosphere had shifted. The air of indifference, of casual disdain, was gone, replaced by a palpable tension. He met Brad's gaze, the young salesman's arrogance now replaced with a dawning realization of his monumental error. Marshall allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The game, he thought, had just begun. The low hum of conversation, a symphony of clinking glasses and hushed laughter, washed over Marshall as he settled deeper into the plush leather armchair. The Silver Oak Club, with its subdued lighting and the aroma of aged mahogany, was a sanctuary, a place where the city's relentless pulse faded to a distant murmur. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice clicking softly against the crystal, a counterpoint to the restless thoughts churning within him. The blatant disregard he'd encountered earlier at Westward Motors, the casual dismissal by that slick salesman, Brad Jensen, still simmered beneath his calm exterior. It wasn't the first time he'd faced such thinly veiled prejudice, the assumption that an elderly black man, regardless of his attire or demeanor, couldn't possibly afford their gleaming machines. But this time, something felt different. This time, the casual insult sparked not anger, but a cold, calculating resolve. He took a slow sip of his whiskey, the warmth spreading through him, a comforting contrast to the icy purpose forming in his mind. This wouldn't be forgotten. He reached for his phone, the cool metal a familiar weight in his hand. Scrolling through his contacts, he paused at the name Raymond Ellis. Raymond, his attorney, his confidant, the man who navigated the labyrinthine world of business with the precision of a surgeon. A small, almost imperceptible smile played on Marshall's lips. Raymond would understand. He tapped the call button, the faint dial tone echoing in the quiet corner of the lounge. "Marshall, is everything all right?" Raymond's voice, even over the phone, carried its usual calm authority. "Raymond, I need you to look into a business for me," Marshall began, his voice low and steady, each word carefully chosen. He could almost picture Raymond, his brow furrowing slightly in concentration, pen poised over a legal pad. "Of course, Marshall. What is it?" "Westward Motors, a luxury car dealership off Camelback Road." A brief silence hung in the air, the background hum of the club momentarily amplified in the pause. Marshall could sense Raymond's mind working, piecing together the information, searching for the underlying reason behind this seemingly out-of-the-blue request. "Westward Motors," Raymond echoed, a thoughtful note creeping into his voice. "Looking to buy a car, Marshall, or buy the dealership?" Marshall chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. The question, so subtly phrased, spoke volumes of Raymond's understanding of his character, his tendency to address problems with finality. "Let's just say I'm exploring all my options, Raymond. I'm particularly interested in the current owner, their financial standing, and any motivation they might have to sell." He could almost hear Raymond's faint smile through the phone. "I understand, Marshall. Consider it done. I'll have a comprehensive report for you by tomorrow morning." "Excellent. Thank you, Raymond." He disconnected the call, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. The first piece was in place. He leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes, letting the ambient sounds of the club wash over him. The image of Brad Jensen's condescending smirk flashed before his mind, a fleeting flicker of annoyance. Soon, very soon, that smirk would be replaced by something else entirely. He allowed himself another small smile, a genuine one this time. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows of Marshall's home office, illuminating the rich mahogany desk and the shelves lined with leather-bound books. He sat behind the desk, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, reviewing the documents Raymond had sent. The report was meticulous, as expected, detailing the financial woes of Westward Motors owner, Douglas Reiner. Reiner, it seemed, was drowning in debt, desperate to offload the dealership. The figures, the declining sales, the mounting liabilities, all painted a clear picture of a business on the brink of collapse. Marshall's initial annoyance had long since solidified into a strategic plan. This wasn't just about buying a car anymore. This was about reclaiming respect, about demonstrating that assumptions based on age and appearance were not only foolish, but could be devastatingly costly. He picked up his phone and dialed Raymond's number. "Raymond, I've reviewed your report. Proceed with the acquisition. Full ownership. Discretion is paramount." "Understood, Marshall. I'll initiate the process immediately. We should be able to finalize the deal within 24 hours. The speed and efficiency with which Raymond operated never ceased to amaze him. Within a day, Westward Motors belonged to Marshall Dupri. The following morning, Marshall stood before the gleaming glass doors of Westward Motors, a subtle shift in his demeanor. The casual observer might not notice it, but the slight set of his jaw, the unwavering gaze, spoke of a quiet power, a sense of purpose. He pushed open the doors, the familiar scent of new leather and polished chrome filling the air. The showroom, once a symbol of exclusion, now belonged to him. Brad Jensen, predictably, was the first to approach, his smile as polished and insincere as the cars he sold. "Welcome back, sir," He began, his tone laced with a hint of condescension. Have you reconsidered the S-Class? Perhaps something more within your budget. Marshall met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Mr. Jensen, he said, his voice calm but firm, I believe there's been a slight misunderstanding. I'm not here to buy a car. Confusion flickered across Jensen's face, momentarily disrupting his practiced sales persona. You don't understand, sir. Just then, Tom Caldwell, the dealership manager, hurried towards them, his face pale and drawn. Mr. Dupri, welcome. We weren't expecting you so soon. He shot a nervous glance at Jensen, who was still struggling to comprehend the situation. Mr. Caldwell, Marshall acknowledged, his gaze shifting to the younger, more unsure salesman, Darren, who stood observing the scene with wide eyes. Gather all the staff. We have a meeting. The meeting was brief and to the point. Marshall, now the owner of Westward Motors, outlined his vision for the dealership, a vision centered on respect, integrity, and exceptional customer service. He spoke of treating every customer with dignity, regardless of their age, appearance, or perceived financial status. He emphasized the importance of employee well-being, promising fair wages and a supportive work environment. He announced Darren's promotion, noting his quiet attentiveness, recognizing the potential where others saw insecurity. And finally, he addressed Brad Jensen directly, his voice devoid of emotion. Mr. Jensen, your services are no longer required. As Jensen sputtered in disbelief, Marshall turned his attention back to the remaining staff, a glimmer of something resembling satisfaction in his eyes. The Silver Oak Club, with its hushed conversations and clinking glasses, seemed a world away. Here, amidst the gleaming chrome and polished leather, he had found a different kind of satisfaction, the quiet power of rewriting the narrative, of transforming a place of exclusion into a space of opportunity. The heavy oak desk, polished to a mirror sheen, reflected the soft glow of the Tiffany lamp. Marshall traced the intricate carvings along its edge, the cool with a familiar comfort beneath his fingertips. The city lights twinkled beyond the panoramic window, a distant hum barely audible over the ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. He could almost taste the bitterness of the afternoon, the casual dismissal in the salesman's eyes still lingering. It was a familiar sting, one he'd felt countless times throughout his life, a subtle reminder of the invisible walls erected by prejudice. But this time, something felt different. A quiet ember of resolve glowed within him, a refusal to accept the status quo. He wasn't just an old man, an easy target for disregard. He was Marshall Dupri, and he had the power to change the narrative. The phone buzzed, a sharp intrusion in the quiet solitude. He picked it up, his voice a low rumble. Dupri. Mr. Dupri. I have Mr. Reiner on the line. Raymond's voice, crisp and efficient, cut through the static. He's ready to discuss the terms. Marshall's grip tightened on the phone. He'd spent his life building empires, turning whispers of opportunity into concrete realities. This wasn't about the car anymore. It was about something more profound, a chance to reshape the landscape, to teach a lesson in respect. Put him through. A hesitant voice crackled through the receiver. Mr. Dupri, this is Douglas Reiner, owner of Westward Motors. I understand you're interested in acquiring the dealership. Reiner's tone was laced with a mix of surprise and apprehension. Marshall could almost picture him, nervously fidgeting in his chair, scrambling to understand the sudden shift in power dynamics. The thought brought a flicker of amusement to Marshall's lips. That's right, Mr. Reiner. I'm prepared to make an offer. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air. Negotiations were a delicate dance, a game of patience and precision. Well, sir, as you know, Westward Motors is a prime location, a well-established business. Reiner's voice trailed off, a hint of desperation creeping in. Marshall knew he had him. Raymond had already done the groundwork, painting a bleak picture of Reiner's financial situation, the mounting debts and dwindling sales figures. I'm aware of its challenges, Mr. Reiner. Marshall's voice was smooth, devoid of any emotion. He could sense Reiner's unease growing. I'm looking for a straightforward transaction, no complications. Of course, Reiner stammered. I'm looking for, let's say, $6.2 million. The figure hung in the air, heavy with unspoken anxieties. Marshall chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. I'll give you 5 cash, and I can have the papers signed before the weekend. He didn't need to haggle. He knew the price was more than fair, given Reiner's predicament. But this wasn't about squeezing every last penny. It was about sending a message. A stunned silence followed. Marshall could practically hear the gears turning in Reiner's head, weighing the offer against the looming threat of bankruptcy. The silence stretched, thick with anticipation. Finally, Reiner's voice, barely a whisper, broke through. 5 million? Cash. That's correct, Mr. Reiner. Take it or leave it. Marshall's tone was firm, unwavering. He could afford to walk away. He had other battles to fight. Another pause, this one shorter. The desperation in Reiner's voice was palpable. All right, Mr. Dupri, to accept your offer. The words were barely audible, choked with a mixture of relief and resignation. Marshall leaned back in his chair, a faint smile playing on his lips. He hadn't just bought a car dealership. He bought a platform, a stage on which to enact his own brand of justice. Excellent, Mr. Reiner. Have your lawyers contact Raymond. I expect everything finalized by Friday. He hung up the phone, the dial tone echoing in the sudden silence. The city lights outside seemed to shimmer with a new intensity, reflecting the quiet triumph he felt. He closed his eyes, imagining the stunned expressions on the faces of the salesman, the arrogant Brad Jensen, the overwhelmed manager. He would dismantle their carefully constructed hierarchy, brick by brick, and rebuild it on a foundation of respect and equality. He wasn't just buying a business. He was buying a chance to rewrite the script. The subtle hum of the city below seemed to harmonize with his thoughts, a symphony of anticipation for the dawn of a new era at Westward Motors. The old man they had dismissed so easily would return, not as a customer, but as the owner, the architect of their future. And in that future, respect wouldn't be earned through the flash of a platinum card, but through the inherent dignity of every individual who walked through the door. The game had changed, and Marshall Dupri was holding all the cards. The stale air of the Westward Motors conference room hung heavy with the scent of cheap coffee and apprehension. Tom Caldwell, the dealership manager, paced a worn path in the threadbare carpet, his tie loosened, his face a canvas of forced composure. He'd received the call, just an hour ago, the kind of call that could flip your life upside down, leaving you clinging to the frayed edges of sanity. He stole a glance at the faces around the table, a mix of confusion and nervous anticipation mirrored his own. Darren, the youngest salesman, fidgeted with his pen, eyes darting towards the door. Even Brad Jensen, usually radiating an air of smug superiority, seemed subdued, a flicker of uncertainty behind his practiced smile. Tom swallowed hard. He had no idea how to explain this. The heavy oak door swung open, revealing not the familiar figure of Douglas Reiner, the previous owner, but a tall, impeccably dressed black man. His suit, a masterpiece of tailoring, spoke of quiet power, and his presence filled the room, demanding attention. Yesterday's worn tweed jacket was gone, replaced by an aura of authority that made Tom's carefully constructed calm crumble further. Behind him, a man of similar bearing, holding a leather briefcase, entered with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned strategist. Tom recognized him vaguely. A lawyer, perhaps? The air crackled with unspoken questions. Brad, however, seemed to recover his usual arrogance quickly. A condescending smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He must have assumed this man was a high-profile client. Tom saw the familiar glint in Brad's eyes, the one that preceded his practice charm offensive, the one that Tom had come to both rely on and resent. "Good morning, sir," Brad began, his voice dripping with practiced cordiality. "Welcome to Westward Motors. How can we help you today?" He didn't offer a handshake, a subtle but clear dismissal based on the man's age. Tom flinched internally. He knew what was coming. The man's gaze, however, did not fall on Brad. He swept the room, his eyes sharp and assessing, lingering for a moment on each face. A small, almost imperceptible smile played on his lips. "Good morning," he replied, his voice deep and resonant, holding an undercurrent of steel. "I believe introductions are in order." He turned toward the man beside him. "This is Raymond Ellis, my attorney." Raymond Ellis nodded curtly, the briefcase held like a shield. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy in the room, thick enough to choke on. Tom shifted uncomfortably, feeling a prickle of unease crawl up his spine. Something was profoundly wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. "Everyone," Tom managed, his voice a little too high-pitched. "Meet your new owner." The words hung in the air, suspended in disbelief. Brad's smirk froze, his eyes widening in a mixture of shock and incredulity. Darren's jaw dropped. The room held its breath, waiting for the punchline to a joke that wasn't funny. The man, Marshall Dupri, allowed a small, genuine smile to touch his lips. He saw the disbelief, the confusion, the fear. He felt a flicker of satisfaction, a cold ember glowing in the ashes of yesterday's humiliation. Yesterday he had been invisible, dismissed, disregarded. Today he held the reins. "Mr. Caldwell informed me that you all were expecting Mr. Reiner," Marshall stated, his voice smooth, betraying none of the complex emotions churning within. He let his gaze settle on Brad, watching the color drain from the salesman's face. "But as of last night, Westward Motors is under new management." Brad's carefully constructed facade crumbled. He stammered, but you were here yesterday." He couldn't seem to form a coherent sentence, the reality of the situation crashing down around him like a collapsing building. He remembered his dismissive behavior, the casual cruelty of ignoring this man, this owner. The internal monologue that had buoyed him with self-importance just hours before now screamed accusations of his own stupidity. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Marshall's smile widened, a sliver of ice in the warmth. "Indeed, I was. I came to purchase a car." His gaze, sharp as a scalpel, dissected Brad's carefully crafted persona, laying bare the shallow arrogance beneath. "See, Brad, it's amazing what people can do when they don't waste their time judging others." The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the frantic ticking of the clock on the wall. Each tick an accusation, a reminder of time wasted, of opportunities missed. "You're fired." The words were spoken softly, almost conversationally, yet they echoed in the stunned silence like a gunshot. Brad flinched as if physically struck. He opened his mouth to speak, to protest, to plead, but no sound came out. His throat was dry, his mind a whirlwind of panic and regret. He had built his career on the art of manipulation, on the ability to read people and exploit their weaknesses. He had been so sure of his judgment, so confident in his ability to discern the haves from the have-nots. He had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. Marshall's gaze shifted to the rest of the staff. The fear in their eyes was palpable. He understood their apprehension, the uncertainty that came with sudden change. But he also saw a flicker of something else, something akin to hope. "As for the rest of you," he continued, his voice losing some of its steel, replaced by a note of genuine sincerity, "I believe in second chances. Westward Motors is going to change. We're going to prioritize customer service, employee well-being, and a culture of respect. Anyone who isn't on board with that vision can follow Mr. Jensen out the door." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. He saw the tension begin to ease, replaced by a cautious optimism. He knew it would take time to rebuild trust, to reshape the culture of this place. But he had the time, the resources, and the unwavering determination to see it through. This wasn't just about buying a car anymore. It was about something much more profound. It was about reclaiming his dignity, and in doing so, perhaps inspiring a little change in the world. Raymond Ellis cleared his throat softly, a silent signal of support. He opened the briefcase, revealing a stack of documents. The details of the transition would be long and complex, but Marshall felt a sense of calm settle over him. He was in control now. The game had changed, and he was holding all the cards. The stale air of the conference room seemed to dissipate, replaced by the crisp, invigorating scent of possibility. The stale air in the Westward Motors conference room, thick with the scent of cheap coffee and apprehension, mirrored the tension clinging to the faces of the assembled staff. Tom Caldwell, the dealership manager, fidgeted with his tie, his gaze darting nervously between the impassive face of Marshall Dupri and the stunned expressions of his sales team. Brad Jensen, his usual swagger replaced by bewildered unease, sat rigidly, his eyes fixed on the mahogany table as if it held the answers to the surreal turn of events. Marshall leaned back in his chair, the faintest hint of a smile playing on his lips. He observed them, cataloging their reactions with a detached curiosity, the same way he might assess the condition of a classic car. He knew what they were thinking: disbelief, fear, perhaps a flicker of resentment. Good, he thought. Let them stew in it for a moment. I believe in efficiency, gentlemen, Marshall began, his voice soft yet commanding, cutting through the silence like a polished blade. So let's dispense with the pleasantries. As the new owner of Westward Motors, I have a few adjustments to make. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Caldwell swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Adjustments, he thought. That's one word for a complete upheaval. He could feel the sweat prickling his forehead. Just yesterday, he'd been fretting over sales quotas and inventory. Now his entire world had been flipped on its head. He glanced at Brad, who looked as though he'd swallowed a lemon. The arrogance that usually clung to him like a designer suit had evaporated, leaving behind a raw, almost boyish vulnerability. Caldwell felt a pang of something akin to pity, quickly replaced by a surge of self-preservation. He needed to adapt, to understand the currents of this new regime. His survival depended on it. Rule number 1, Marshall stated, his voice unwavering: no customer gets ignored. I don't care if they walk in wearing overalls or a tailored suit. Everyone who steps foot in this dealership deserves respect. His gaze swept across the room, lingering on Brad. Everyone, he emphasized internally, recalling the sting of yesterday's dismissal. He saw a flicker of defiance in Brad's eyes, quickly masked by a forced neutrality. The young man's internal struggle was transparent to Marshall. Years of ingrained prejudice didn't simply vanish overnight. But Marshall had time. He had patience. He would dismantle those prejudices brick by brick if necessary. Rule number 2, no judgments. You're not here to assess a customer's net worth based on their appearance. You're here to sell cars, provide excellent service, answer their questions, and let them decide what they can afford. Marshall watched as a ripple of unease passed through the sales team. He could practically hear their internal calculations, the frantic reevaluation of their sales strategies. The commission-based system, which had fostered a culture of cutthroat competition and selective attention, was about to be dismantled, and they knew it. He allowed himself a small, inward smile. The dismantling had begun. Rule number 3, Marshall continued, his voice taking on a steely edge, we're done with commission-based greed. Starting today, salaries are restructured. Base pay increases and bonuses will be tied to overall customer satisfaction, not individual sales figures. The murmuring started then, a low hum of discontent that quickly escalated into open protest. Brad, emboldened by the rising dissent, shifted in his seat. Mr. Dupri, with all due respect, he began, his voice laced with a forced politeness that barely concealed his resentment. This new system, it disincentivizes top performers. We're driven by competition, by the reward for exceeding expectations. Marshall met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Driven by greed, you mean, he thought, but he kept his voice calm. Mr. Jensen, he responded, his tone even, I believe in rewarding excellence, not exploitation. Customer satisfaction is the ultimate metric. A happy customer is a returning customer. A returning customer is the foundation of a successful business. Is that not an incentive worth striving for? He paused, letting his words hang in the air. The room fell silent, the sales team momentarily stunned into submission. Darren, the younger salesman who had served him the previous day, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He met Marshall's gaze, a flicker of understanding, perhaps even agreement, in his eyes. Marshall held his gaze for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of the young man's nascent awareness. He's the one to watch, Marshall thought. He might actually get it. Raymond Ellis, Marshall's attorney, sat silently observing the proceedings. He'd witnessed countless business negotiations, boardroom battles, and corporate takeovers. But this was different. This wasn't just about profit margins and market share. This was personal. He saw the quiet fire burning in Marshall's eyes, the unwavering resolve beneath the calm exterior. He knew his friend, knew the depth of his convictions. This wasn't just about buying a car dealership. It was about reclaiming dignity, about challenging a system built on prejudice and indifference. It was about making a statement. Marshall rose from his chair, his movements deliberate, his presence commanding. "I expect all of you to embrace these changes," he stated, his voice resonating with authority. "Those who can't adapt well, there are plenty of other dealerships in town." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room one last time. "This is not a negotiation. This is a new beginning." He turned and walked towards the door, Raymond following close behind. The silence in the conference room stretched, thick with uncertainty and the weight of unspoken questions. The era of Brad Jensen, and all he represented, was over. A new era had begun. Sunlight, fractured by the large showroom windows, cast elongated diamonds across the polished floor of Westward Motors. The air, usually thick with the aroma of new leather and ambition, now held a different scent, a subtle blend of fresh coffee and something akin to hope. Marshall Dupri, a man who'd seen more sunrises than most, leaned against a sleek, obsidian pillar, his cane hooked over his arm. He watched, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, as the dealership he now owned thrummed with a newfound energy. He hadn't bought the gleaming metal machines or the sprawling building. He'd purchased the opportunity to rebuild, to reshape, to prove a point etched deep within the marrow of his 72 years. His eyes, reservoirs of wisdom and a lifetime of keenly observed injustices, focused on a young salesman, Darren. The lad, barely out of his 20s if Marshall's guess was right, stood before an elderly black gentleman, his posture respectful, his tone earnest. A stark contrast to the dismissive air that had permeated this space only yesterday. Yesterday, the memory of the blatant disregard, the sting of Brad Jensen's condescension, still simmered beneath Marshall's calm exterior. He hadn't felt the urge to prove anything in years, content to let his accomplishments speak for themselves. Yet, something about the casual cruelty, the assumption of his insignificance based on his age and the color of his skin, had stirred something primal within him. It wasn't just about the car anymore. It was about dignity, respect. It was about rewriting the narrative. Darren was patiently explaining the features of a silver sedan, his hand gesturing towards the dashboard, his words clear and unhurried. The customer, a man who shared Marshall's rich melanin and the weight of years, listened intently, occasionally interjecting with a question. The interaction was simple, devoid of the usual performative charm of a sales pitch. It was genuine. Remarkable what a little respect can achieve, Marshall murmured to himself, his voice a low rumble. He adjusted his silk tie, the faint whisper of the fabric a counterpoint to the quiet hum of conversation around him. This, he realized, was more satisfying than any luxury car. This subtle shift in atmosphere, the tangible evidence of change, was the true prize. He noticed Tom Caldwell, the dealership manager, hovering nervously near the edge of the showroom, his gaze darting between Darren and the customer, then flickering towards Marshall. The man's face was a canvas of conflicting emotions: apprehension, confusion, and a grudging acceptance. Marshall understood his unease. Overnight, the ground had shifted beneath Caldwell's feet. The familiar hierarchy, the unspoken rules that had governed this space, had been dismantled. Marshall pushed himself off the pillar, the faint click of his cane against the polished floor echoing in the relative quiet. He strolled towards Darren and the customer, his gait steady, his presence commanding. He didn't want to interrupt, not yet. He wanted to observe, to absorb, to let the scene unfold organically. He wanted to witness the seed of change taking root. Darren glanced up as Marshall approached, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He seemed to hesitate, caught between continuing his conversation with the customer and acknowledging the new owner. "You waiting for permission to do your job?" Marshall asked, his voice soft yet carrying an undeniable authority. The question hung in the air, a gentle reprimand, a subtle reminder of the new ethos of Westward Motors. Darren's eyes widened slightly. Then he shook his head, a faint flush rising on his cheeks. "No, sir," he replied, his voice regaining its earlier confidence. "Just making sure Mr. Davis here has all the information he needs." Marshall nodded, a silent approval that seemed to settle Darren's nerves. He turned to the customer, offering a warm smile. "Mr. Davis," he said, extending a hand, "I'm Marshall Dupri." The older gentleman grasped his hand, his grip firm, his eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. "A pleasure, Mr. Dupri," he replied. "I must say, there's a different feel to this place today." Marshall chuckled, a low rumble in his chest. "Indeed," he agreed, his gaze sweeping across the showroom. He caught Tom Caldwell's eye and gestured for him to approach. The manager hesitated for a moment, then walked over, his steps measured, his expression carefully neutral. He reminded Marshall of a tightrope walker, balancing precariously on a newly strung wire. "Tom," Marshall said, his voice even, "I bought this place because it was broken, and I don't invest in anything unless I know I can fix it." He paused, letting the words sink in. "This," he continued, gesturing towards Darren and Mr. Davis, "this is how we fix it, by treating every customer with the respect they deserve." Caldwell's face remained impassive, but Marshall noticed the slight clenching of his jaw, the subtle twitch of his eyelid. The man was struggling to adapt, to reconcile the old ways with the new. Marshall knew it wouldn't be easy. Change rarely was. But he also knew that change was necessary. He'd seen too much of the world, witnessed too many injustices, to stand idly by and let the status quo prevail. He had the resources, the will, and the time to make a difference, and Westward Motors, in its own small way, was where he would start. The faint hum of the showroom lights, the hushed murmur of conversations, the gleam of polished chrome, all of it felt different now. It was a space transformed, not just by a change of ownership, but by a shift in perspective. And in the quiet satisfaction of that realization, Marshall Dupri found a reward far greater than any fleeting thrill of a new car. This, he knew, was a legacy worth building.